Yeah, so my dissertation research already very much involved me in historical research, and well, we all know perhaps the famous statement by Edward Evans-Pritchard that anthropology is historical or it is nothing. I couldn't agree more there, but I think I've become more and more convinced of that. First, a little bit by accident. Like I said, I ended up doing a lot of archival work because that was all I could do in Dar es Salaam without having a residence permit in my field research area. But increasingly also because I came to realize that what I found important in cultural explanation was these longer-term historical sequences, and I felt I learned sometimes more from them than from thinking in terms of what you could call, you know, the big theories about human life in general. And I think that has continued until today, and even today I would be even more radical and say we've been so positivist that we've neglected the importance of contingent explanations, right? And the power of structures that are created historically, that emerge before they are simply not there, and then at a certain point in time they emerge in a certain place, and people cannot live without them any longer. Just as much as these kind of structures can have an enormously long-term influence on people, even though, you know, they were made by people. And so this whole idea of social science having been built on the idea of natural law, so to speak, right, which is of course borrowed from the sciences, from the hard sciences, increasingly starts to erode. I don't think there is such a thing as natural law, because even in the natural world, if you can make that distinction between culture and nature, we know climate change, etc. We know that we have difficulty doing that right now. You know, many biologists and ecologists also now say that you know, the ecologies are historical constructs, and there are few ecologies in the world that haven't been influenced by human beings or human activity in some way. So that's a bigger reflection, a sort of anti-positivist and very historical ethos that I've increasingly come to accept and underwrite. But I think the first things that made me reflect on that for our own practice as anthropologists had to do with what I began to realize is the importance of ethnographic traditions as they were established for specific places in the world. And of course it started with my own field site. It was obviously a place where for a long time very few actual anthropologists came about, and the one that made most of his name there was in fact an old colonial administrator. Henry Vosbroek had spent quite a lot of time as an assistant district officer, I think it was, in the area at a crucial point in time. And he later became the director of the Rose Livingston Institute in what was still Northern Rhodesia. These lines, these historical lines, affected my own perspective on the society where I was doing research, but they were also partially constructed by people who weren't members of those societies. So this whole idea of what does ethnography do to the society where it is being recorded became important to me. And it had a lot to do with, in fact, an important moment during my fieldwork, and a very emotional moment, because my adopted father, so the father of Adriani, who was my good friend there, in whose house I was living, he had become my key informant. In fact, we spent most of the Sunday after church drinking native beer and smoking cigarettes. I tried to smoke his cigarettes, but I nearly died when I tried to inhale that. This is native tobacco rolled in newspaper, right? It's a very sweet man, but with a weak health, as many of the family, because of blood pressure and issues. Those issues. He died all of a sudden of a second or maybe even a third stroke. Into my, I think it was my second term in fieldwork. And of course, amidst all the sadness and the fact that people could see that I was genuinely, overwhelmed by the emotion of losing him, all of a sudden, people came to me and accepted me as a member of the extended family. With the result that one of Mama's uncles, and in a matrilineal society, the uncle is, supremely important authority. This man, who was a major leader in a neighboring village, came to me and said, Peter, when will we continue our discussion? And I said, continue our discussion? I thought we'd finished, right? I had come to him, as I came to a lot of other elders, to talk about political succession. So who succeeded whom, and more or less when that happened, because I needed to place these indigenous politics against the way the British were writing about it. And I'd seen about, 10, 12 of these elders, and all of them recounted the same male sequence. So passing on from uncle to nephew all the time, if that was possible. And he said, no, we haven't finished, we haven't done the mothers. And I thought, mothers? Nobody told me anything about mothers. So first I asked Mama, I said, he's asking me, he's telling me about mothers. Yes, of course, yeah, there's also a whole sequence of mothers. And I suddenly realized that in all the documents, the ethnographic documents I read about that society, the British administrators had only recorded the male sequence. They didn't even know that there was a parallel female sequence, not equal, a little bit like that, but there were important exchanges between those two lines, because when the male superior of the whole family died, they discussed who should succeed him, and the ones in the most places, the ones who did the discussing were the elder women. They decided who was most suited, and I learned something about matrilineal succession that I simply didn't know. They said, oh yeah, he should actually get it, right? So the immediate brother, but he's a drunkard. He's not suited. And then we have, the son of his sister, but he constantly talks about moving to Dar es Salaam, right? We can't use someone who is not here. So they went to the next. They said, yeah, he's got a good character and he's got a good wife, right? so that decision process also all of a sudden became clear to me, because people had changed my status from a guest into a son of the family. And literally they switched also. They didn't address me as Bwana any longer, which was also the title for a colonial administrator. They started to call me Baba or Kaka, so father, or sometimes reminiscent of the missionaries, or Kaka, the older brother. So it's that made me realize that, in fact, my whole trust in written archives started to evaporate at that moment. And that became quite important later on as well in a project that I'm still engaged in as a kind of microhistory built partly on oral history, where the oral history turned out to be more reliable than the archival history. But in this particular case, I realized these ethnographies are no accurate reflection of the situation there, because either they make a strange selection, or they're written from a certain perspective. So, which was obviously also what people in the writing culture, literary turn, had been preaching, right? That ethnographies are artifacts; they're not straightforward reflections of a reality, right? That representation is something more than just reflecting, mirroring a kind of reality. And this idea was very much present when I, returned to Amsterdam to write my thesis. And at the Amsterdam School for Social Science Research, I think it was already called that by the time. I can't remember. They changed names several times anyway. But one other PhD had just arrived, having done field work in among the Hmong in the Vietnamese mountain areas. Oscar Salemink became one of my, I guess, best intellectual and personal friends. And we were introduced to each other by the then director of the school, Hans Sonneveld, who said, "I think you will like each other's work." And he turned out to be completely right, because both of us had this interest in ethnographies written under colonial circumstances. And after a very short while already, we realized that we wanted to organize a conference. I think it's one of, after the conference for Bob Scholten, this was probably one of the most important ones I ever did again. But this one was much smaller scale, a workshop of about 30 people, with the title Colonial Ethnographies. And we invited everyone we could think of or could get who were doing that kind of work at the time, because it was really the time of, going back to historical sources, but with this critical vision of how do the ethnographies select out the message that they put forward, and what happened, where does that come from, what is the social background and the historical background, given that we have too rarely brought this colonial situation into the understanding of the ethnography itself. And obviously, this was a process that was epitomized by some of the essays in the Writing Culture volume. Right, that beautiful essay on Evans-Pritchard, for example, and of course, work by Clifford Geertz himself on other ethnographies. All of a sudden, that whole idea that a text is a product of a certain socio-historical situation was hip and fashionable, and we got together an amazing group of people, historians, anthropologists, some literary critics, Vince Raphael, Rana Jitgua, the subaltern studies group was represented. You should realize Amsterdam Amsterdam was a real network of international contacts at that particular time. I think we held a conference in 1993, the year that I also graduated, and in that same year, Peter van der Veer arrived back from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where he had met Arjuna Padurai and became good friends with him. He had an extensive network of very good British anthropologists, whom I also knew from the Critique of Anthropology group. We had these wonderful historians being brought in from South Asia, right? So it was an extremely dynamic academic environment at the time, in which I was lucky to graduate. Right? I could look around for a job. There weren't many, but at the same time, I felt supported by the fact that I had all these major figures who turned out to be interested in the things that we were doing. This ended up in 2 volumes, actually. One was a special issue of History and Anthropology called Colonial Ethnographies, which we could do because 2 of our participants were Christopher Pinney and Nick Thomas, who was then already becoming, one of the foremost writers on colonial relationships and anthropology. They were the editors of the journal at the time. Nick also published my PhD thesis, although it took a while to rewrite it, 6 years in fact. From that on, because we felt we wanted to do a little more with that material, we also tried to make a book out of it, and that appeared as Colonial Subjects, with the title Colonial Subjects, with the University of Michigan Press, in the same year as my thesis was published. And that book, it was a sequence, in a sense that what our first intention was, and what came out of a lot of these important articles, was to show that, first of all, anthropologists shouldn't look upon ethnography as their own method or way of writing, because by that they would deny the influence of all those prior historical texts, including, the reports by colonial administrators, but also travelogues and all that knowledge that they penned down was often already in the air somehow, and certainly, and that is something that I only later came to realize how important that is, certainly in terms of how groups of people were classified, because very often the ethnography simply took up the colonial designation of a people, but that name was already a construct. Right, and I learned that from early on, because Waluguru, who live in Uluguru, simply means in local Bantu languages, it means the people of the high mountains. So the name was given by the people in the plains, who, when say the first expeditions moved through, they asked, who live there? Oh, those are the people of the high mountains. Yeah, obviously they live up there. That kind of thing. And of course that also happened a lot with denigrating names, right? And people like Evans-Pritchard, for example, still used terms for some of the groups that they were researching that were actually, how do you put that? There was slander words, from neighboring peoples who didn't like them. So those were that I came to realize the importance of those classifications actually. Well, not much later, but I've recently again made it a topic of research, and it's extremely important for, the way anthropologists nowadays have to be and are occupied with issues of diversity in all kinds of forms. So it has a very contemporary ring to it. But at that time, we were really interested in the question: what were the social relationships, what were the constructions of social relationships, historical constructions that gave rise to a certain ethnographic output. And we started to realize also, because both Oscar and me were familiar with work by missionaries as well as work by colonial administrators, that these ethnographies were very different. And in colonial ethnographies, I actually published an essay which I used parts later on in my thesis also, that says that you could actually distinguish what I called in that essay an ethnocratic strategy, which means an ethnography built into but also completely complicit with the idea of governing a certain ethnic group. It means you draw boundaries around it. You actually literally usually say you are not allowed to cross those boundaries, right? So some people in Uluguru had problems because they wanted to migrate to Dar es Salaam, and the district commissioner said, we can't allow them to do that. No, they have to stay put. They're Waluguru, they belong here. And of course the Waluguru themselves never looked upon themselves as Waluguru. They had different names, usually, lineage names related to these extended families that peopled a valley in a certain sequence, also a very historical process. So we started to think in terms of, what is the interest of missionaries in writing an ethnography? Well, of course, they want to convert people. That means that they are interested in individual baptisms, right? Baptisms are, those are sort of, if you can quantify a lot of baptisms, you're a happy missionary, so to speak. That's basically, that's a logical conclusion. But it literally meant, and I could show that with the data I had, it literally meant that they wrote about life sequences. They wrote about, important moments of transition in an individual life, initiations. Of course, also because initiations should be Christian, not pagan, right? Pagan initiations were suspect. That was why they had a lot of trouble with the fact that the women of those in those valleys in Uluguru were stubbornly refusing to get rid of the female initiation. They had managed to actually get rid of the boys' initiation already, not by much force, but also because Waluguru themselves thought, well, I don't think we need that, or we have something else, we have schools now. But girls in schools were not a good mix, at least not according to indigenous people. So you could see in the ethnography by the missionaries that their interest in someone's life cycle and the fact that that was crucial for whether they became Catholic or remained Catholic, or, were adulterous, so they couldn't get the sacraments, or in fact went to a medicine man, so they had to they had to consider actually excommunicating them altogether. You could see that reflected in those ethnographies. And those ethnographies themselves started to influence what later people wrote about it. Especially because the so-called ethnocratic strategy, so the one done by the colonial administrators, was taken up by later anthropologists who turned it into an academic publication. And like I said, that one-sided focus on the male line in a matrilineal society was one of the things that was reproduced. So that showed that whatever was going on in relation to Uluguru, once people used those ethnographies, they would reproduce those same mistakes. And that turned out to be important for a lot of different things. This is a theme that occupied me for a long time. I had a lot of contacts with other people working on, the history of ethnography, the history of representing others, usually under colonial circumstances. That was also because we had a lot of good contacts with all the members of the Subaltern Studies Collective. So we had a lot of wonderful discussions with people like Jan Prakash and Partha Chatterjee and other people who took over from Ranajit Guha in the editing of the journal. One of the things also that was very important in that respect was that shortly after basically, like I said, after I graduated in 1993, there were very few jobs. But I was lucky that once again a new institute was set up. I got a job there because they didn't have many other candidates. Again, under the working with Peter van der Veer, who then later could give me a part-time job in his own religion and society group. But that also landed me as a very young researcher and assistant professor. The appointment as the temporary Netherlands visiting professor at the University of Michigan with the Michigan Anthro-History Group, which was doing all this kind of work. People like Nicholas Dirks and Stoller were all in that group, and I had the enormous privilege of studying with them, becoming to some extent a sort of honorary PhD, although I had already graduated. In fact, also being adopted by the PhDs at the University of Chicago, the PhDs of Jean and John Komarov, who we also saw quite often. And of course, since by that time I had also become great friends with Peter Geschire, we had a very tight community also of critical Africanist anthropologists, who all were interested in that idea of historical formations of culture. And I think that theme is very important for anthropology today as well, but also shaped most of what I think is also affecting us nowadays, right? The decolonization is still happening, and it will probably take a very, very long time, if ever, that it will be, that its traces will no longer be visible. Maybe I should leave it at that.